Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Fiber for Breakfast. We're now in our 44th episode of 2022. Before I kick off, I'd like to thank Nokia, the gold sponsor for Fiber for Breakfast. Today I'm in Washington, D.C. as we've been invited to the White House as part of the administration's Infrastructure Talent Pipeline Challenge. As you know, the Fiber Broadband Association is rolling out its Optics Path fiber optic technician training program to veterans, community colleges, and training institutes all the 56 states and territories. And we're pleased that NTI included our program as a best practices in their workforce playbook that's part of the BEAD program. We'll also announced last week our collaboration agreement with WIA, where the Fiber Broadband Association will be rolling out our 144-hour fiber optic technician training, and WIA will be administering our Department of Labor accredited 2,000-hour apprenticeship program as part of its TIRAP program. Speaking of training, our next regional Fiber Connect workshop will be held in Columbus, Ohio, tomorrow on November 3rd. This event is sold out, and we will be including our Train the Trainer for our fiber optic technician program. Both FBA and WIA will be working with the state of Ohio on workforce development. The Columbus event will break all our records so far with our regional fiber workshops. Our next regional Fiber Connect event will be in Raleigh, North Carolina on February 7th. This Friday, November 4th, is Give Me Fiber Day, designated in 2013 by the Fiber to the Home Council Global Alliance to showcase how fiber has positively impacted communities around the world and what policymakers around the globe can do to help advance the rollout and take up of fiber optics. November 4th was selected as it corresponds with the birthday of the man who has changed the way the world communicates, Professor Charles Kao. To celebrate, the Fiber Broadband Association will be hosting its second annual Twitter chat all day long, so join us on Twitter at Fiber Broadband throughout the day to share your perspectives and interact with others, members of the fiber ecosystem, to discuss key topics affecting our industry. And you can also follow along with hashtag Give Me Fiber Day. Yeah, that's hashtag Give Me Fiber Day. Today on Fiber for Breakfast, we have the opportunity to talk with Kate O'Connor and Evan View of the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology with the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Energy and Commerce on the overcoming permitting roadblocks to BEAD deployment. Before I introduce today's guests, I'd like to introduce Trish Ehlers, our team, who's going to take us through some housekeeping items.
Thank you, Gary, and good morning to everyone who's joined us this morning. Before I go over a few logistical items, I'd like to once again thank our Fiber for Breakfast Gold sponsor, Nokia. Now, if everyone would keep in mind, all participants are in listen mode only. To ask a question, please type it into the question box located within your control panel on the right side of your screen. We'll host a Q&A session with our panelists at the end of today's session. Today's presentation is being recorded and will be available to members only on FBA's website within 24 hours. You can find the recording in the Events tab under the Fiber for Breakfast drop-down option. At the conclusion of the presentation, you'll be prompted to complete a very brief feedback survey. Please take a minute to do so. We truly appreciate your input. I'll pass it back to Gary now to introduce our panelists and get us started. Gary?
Thanks, Trish, and good morning. I'm Gary Bolton, the President and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association. Last week on Fiber for Breakfast, we spoke with Paul Croonan, the CEO of i3 Broadband, on the commitment to serve yields sky-high NPS. Net promoter scores are going to become a recurring theme on Fiber for Breakfast, as next week we'll be discussing how NPS is driving Wall Street's investment decisions. Today on Fiber for Breakfast, we have the opportunity to talk with Kate O'Connor and Evan View of the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology with the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Energy and Commerce on overcoming permitting roadblocks to BEAD deployment. Kate O'Connor is the Chief Counsel for the Subcommittee on Communications Technology, and she has previously served as the Chief of Staff for NTIA, where she worked on legislative and communications policy focused on spectrum and broadband issues. She also worked in NTIA's Office of Congressional Affairs, engaged with Congress, state government officials, and other federal agencies to advance the administration's legislative initiatives on broadband and 5G. Kate attended the University of Chicago. Kevin View serves as a professional staff member for the Communications and Technology with the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, Republican staff. Among other issues that Evan works on include broadband, supply chain security, spectrum, and media policy. Previously, Evan served as a legislative assistant to Representative Tim Walberg of Michigan, where he handled the congressman's legislative priorities on Energy and Commerce Committee and other issues. Evan attended the University of Michigan. So welcome, Kate and Evan. And for audience, please type in your questions as we go and we'll work them into the discussion. With that, I'd like to get things kicked off, and I'll turn it over to Kate and Evan to provide, maybe start with some background on the subcommittee and what the key issues that you're focused on.
Thanks, Gary, and thanks for having us here today. So our subcommittee has jurisdiction over NTIA and the Federal Communications Commission. So over the last couple of years, we've really been paying attention to all of the broadband funding that's gone out the door. There really has been an unprecedented amount of funding across multiple agencies made available for broadband deployment, which is exciting. Our members have been talking about it for years, the need to invest in broadband infrastructure to make sure that all Americans are connected. I think the need for broadband was especially highlighted during the COVID-19 pandemic, although we've known that this has been an issue for quite some time. The infrastructure bill provided over $42 billion for broadband deployment, which is in addition to the other funding streams that have already been out there and made available for broadband on top of the COVID relief packages, which also included money for broadband. Yet none of these bills included any sort of meaningful permitting reforms, which is something that our boss and our members have been really passionate about and talking about for now spanning multiple Congresses. These barriers will really only delay deployment and increase costs, meaning American families are just going to remain, longer before getting access to the internet. So after actually this was prior to the infrastructure bill passing, our members introduced over 28, so permit broadband, yeah, Evan's nodding, so 20 is the right number, broadband permitting proposals to roll back some of these barriers to broadband deployment. And, while fiber is definitely the gold standard, we recognize that it may not be the most feasible in many parts of the country. So knowing that this funding needs to be stretched as far as possible, our permitting bills actually reduce barriers to both fixed and mobile technology. So permitting reform is definitely going to be a top priority for Leader Rogers. It continues to be a top priority. She's talked about this not only in the broadband space, but across all of the subcommittees that are in the jurisdiction of the Energy and Commerce Committee. Oversight is another top priority for the Congresswoman. We've had NTIA Assistant Secretary Alan Davidson and FCC Chairwoman Rosa Mursell up before this committee once this entire Congress, once each. And that's just frankly not enough for all of the funding that's gone out the door since 2020. Our boss is very passionate about Congress performing its duties of oversight and making sure that these agencies are actually spending the money and acting in accordance with the laws that Congress passes. So with that, I am happy to answer any questions. I'm joined by my colleague, Evan. Evan, I don't know if you want to add anything, but he's been obviously great. It's been just the two of us for the last 3 years. So we've worked really closely on these permitting bills and all of these broadband programs. So happy to be here.
Yeah, and thank you. And I would just like to echo my thanks as well to Gary and all the members that are joining the call today. A lot of this work that we've been able to do is in part because we're hearing and listening to the problems that you all are seeing, out there in the world, and we're trying to be responsive to that. So look forward to any questions.
Hey, thanks, Evan and Kate. And maybe to start off with is, and you, Kate, talked a little bit about this, but in your opinion, why does the permitting problem require legislation to remedy it?
Yeah, well, first of all, many of the areas that it's difficult to deploy broadband are on federal lands, and especially in the Western United States. We have a lot of members on the committee that come from Western states, and federal agencies are responsible for managing that land. Federal environmental and historic preservation laws are also at the federal level, and so any changes to those laws or those processes would likely require action by Congress. Our committee also regulates interstate communications networks and market entry, and so again, permitting at its core is really about market entry, and you know, there's obviously a role for state and local governments here as well, but you know, we need to balance a lot of the interests in making sure that not only do we get critical, you know, reviews done in a timely manner, but that they're done, you know, timely, and they're done at kind of a fair cost to those that are willing to put their investment on the line to serve American families.
Well, thanks, Evan. You know, you guys have heard from the fiber broadband associations and our members about the challenges that we're really facing as a result of permitting obstacles. Would you consider inviting state and local officials that we work with to testify to find out what they believe Congress can do to support their needs to expedite permitting?
Absolutely. I mean, should we have that ability to invite or have, I guess, the hearings on this issue? But yeah, I mean, I think that it's really important to have all the voices at the table. State and local governments are a huge part of that. For a long time, we were hearing that, and we've heard this from many of your members, that part of the reason that it took so long for them to process permits at their level was because of resources. But again, this goes back to the fact that between all of the COVID packages and the different funding streams that have gone out the door, there's a lot of funding out there right now. So if the resources are there, and if those are not being allocated appropriately, we need to know about it. And NTIA, including with the BEAD program, will have the ability to approve state plans, and the states will have a lot of say in how those funds get spent and where they go. And so we absolutely think that they need to be a part of the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you mentioned this, Kate, that you know we would historically seen about $4 billion a year of federal subsidies for broadband, and now with between all the funding with ARPA and the capital projects and with BEAD coming, we're looking at probably 6-7 times the amount of CapEx, and then on top of that, we're seeing an equal part of private investment. So it's going to be overwhelming to people who are doing permitting. We can't operate at the same pace that we've done in the past. So given the type, well, maybe start with, can you guys share with us kind of the basic outline of the draft legislation that you think will address the broadband permitting?
Sure, and I know, I believe the link to our website that includes all the 28 bills has been shared in advance, so I won't go through all of them individually. But it's really helpful, I think, to just think about the 4 areas that we can provide targeted relief. And again, these are based off specific problems that we've heard from providers over the years. So the first one is promoting new infrastructure deployment where it doesn't already exist. And I think this is one that obviously we all recognize the challenges. There's barriers there. The second one is as we look to upgrading existing infrastructure and perhaps enhancing service, or in the wireless space, moving to 5 or 6G. In the fixed side, there's a lot of infrastructure that's already been deployed that maybe we can take advantage of. So promoting deployment and consumer choice through co-location and allowing modifications to existing infrastructure to be a big driver. The third one, there's obviously a role for environmental and historic reviews, but a lot of times those reviews are either unnecessary or duplicative, where there's either, again, already an infrastructure siting that's been approved, whether it's a tower or conduit for fiber. So where, again, there's already been a review, or the review may not be necessary, looking where we can reduce some of that redundancy. And then the fourth bucket is promoting broadband deployment on federal lands. As I mentioned, there's a lot of different agencies that all have a role in approving broadband applications on federal lands. In some areas, like for example, in some counties out in the Western United States, there could be multiple agencies within a pretty small area, and they all kind of fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. And so if you don't have a streamlined process at the agency level, you may not understand where to go or which agency to go to, and things like having a common application fee and a common standard fee for the rental of that land, having points of contacts at agencies, having an online application portal so you don't have to deal with paperwork in the old school sense. These are all things that I think are just pretty straightforward that could go a long way.
Yeah, thanks, Evan. Given these type timelines, to build out all the required award winner under BEAD and the other federal broadband programs, how big a problem do you guys see this becoming if we're unable to take legislative or administrative steps to fix it?
Yeah, I think there's a number of challenges, and as Kate alluded to, there's, I think, a missed opportunity here to address meaningful permitting reforms through the infrastructure law. We actually recently sent a letter, our boss, ranking member Kathy McMorris Rogers from Washington, and Senator Wicker, who's our counterpart in the Senate, sent a letter to NTIA urging them to work with states, as they work with state broadband offices across the country when they're reviewing those plans, to use that local collaboration as a means to, incentivize and require permitting reforms. I think, frankly, these permitting reforms, and especially the legislation that our members have put forward, will have benefits that outlive BEAD and RDOF and all these other programs. And so legislation, I think, really, again, is it'll provide a lot of certainty that businesses need. And I think, given the cost of inflation and other, factors that have raised the cost of deploying broadband, even since the infrastructure law, being able to streamline these processes will stretch that funding even further.
I think there's, just to add on to that, I mean, our boss has been really passionate about enacting permitting reforms, and to the extent NTIA can actually do some of this on its own as conditions of grant awards, that would be great. But I think that it's been pretty clear over the past couple of years that red tape really does have the possibility to kill projects. So $42 billion seems like a lot of money. It is a lot of money. But if we don't change all of the processes that allow that $42 billion to actually get spent to deploy this infrastructure, it could all be wasted. So I think that I think the timing is really important. And I think that there's really significant issues that will arise if these permitting reforms aren't enacted quickly.
No, agreed. So, we know the administration has looked at this question as well. Are there steps that they can take through executive order or executive branch mechanisms that will help confront the problem? Do you see this as complementary to the legislations that you'd like to move on?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some cases they're definitely complementary. I was actually looking back, and a lot of the work that we have done on the federal lands issues has been looked at for multiple administrations, going back to the first Bush administration in 2002. They were starting to look at this issue of, there's lots of different agencies and they all manage, different federal lands, and how can we streamline or maybe standardize a lot of these processes across each agency? And so under the Trump administration, there was actually an initiative, the American Broadband Initiative, that looked up at a lot of the things that agencies really could just review, all of their rules and regulations and take a hard look at what's working and what isn't. Some of that, I think, we also want to address on a legislative side, and have, put forward pieces of legislation to do that. There's also issues, though, that are outside of the executive branch and even the FCC. And so, we've looked at those as well. And that spans whether it's the fixed and fiber community, whether that's the wireless community, or whether that's like the cable industry. There's parts of the law kind of are different depending on which part of the industry you're in. And so we've taken a very close look at what we can do that maybe the executive branch cannot do.
Even
Great.
setting aside sort of the permitting issue specifically, just really quickly, we passed the Access Broadband Act a couple of years ago, which requires NTIA to track all of the federal broadband funding streams. And I really think that close coordination among the different agencies that have federal funds for broadband deployment is a really big part of this as well. So that is certainly something that the administration has the authority to do. They can hold these agencies accountable and make sure that the funding is going to areas that need it.
And one of the things I'll just kind of add to this, there's some problems that we've seen in the past where, agencies maybe have not always been kind of viewed as a broadband agency, or they've been focused on like oil and gas permitting. And so we've heard concerns that, as agencies kind of have sub bureaus or, ranger stations that maybe serve a very small kind of part of the country, that this just isn't an issue that maybe has necessarily always crossed their desk. And so one of the things that we've tried to do through the legislation is empower NTIA to really just prioritize this and make sure that agencies are focused on it, informing them that there's a standard form now that should, be used across the federal government. That was something that we did in a bipartisan way in 2018, in trying to spur on the federal side, some of the permitting challenges at agencies.
Great. So what about, in your judgment, is permitting mostly a federal problem, or is it equal parts state and federal?
It's definitely both, and I think it's important to recognize too at the outset. Most state and local governments are doing a great job. They're working collaboratively. Providers and the state and local governments all generally have the same goal of wanting their community to get served with high quality, high speed broadband. There is a cost, right, to staffing and processing these applications. It's not like there's magic pixie dust that we should just get them done overnight. And so I think when we look at the federal and state issues, the federal issues on things like the environmental and historic preservation reviews or federal lands issues, we recognize that we have some work to do in our backyard and our role. But there's also, I think, an expectation among providers that when they work with their state and local governments, that they're being responsive, that there's a very clear set of processes that if they follow them, that they know that investment is going to be worthwhile. And in some cases, we've seen that state and local governments may not always have that same view. And so, I think there's ample room to achieve the permitting goals that we've kind of laid out through our legislation and setting some reasonable boundaries for state and local governments, again, as the regulator of interstate commerce. But we also want to make sure that there's flexibility there so that states and local governments do have that ability to perform the reviews that are needed, while again providing timely responses to providers and making sure that things like the cost for reviewing that application are tied to the direct cost for actually reviewing the application.
Yeah, so for those elements of permitting that are state and local, what steps should or can the federal government take to better advance the federal policies of timely future-proof broadband infrastructure expansion? For example, can federal funding incentives be used to implement uniform permitting timelines and deem granted rules in the same way that the federal government used to incentivize like the legal drinking age limits and things like that?
I think that it really is going to take an all hands approach. And so the federal government really needs to sort of set the standard, which I realize kind of sounds like it's very antithetical to the way that things are actually working right now. But I think that there are a lot of things that we can do from our level, which can help sort of loosen up the restrictions on the state and local side. And I think if we set that example from the top and we actually start enacting some reforms, it will also help them do that on the state and local level. Evan, sorry, I didn't mean to jump in, but go ahead if you want to add anything.
No, that's great. And as Kate mentioned before, there is a $350 billion coronavirus relief fund that went to state and local governments for exactly this sort of thing, right? They're going to be expanding a lot of the services they're performing, because of COVID. And that funding stream, I think, was important and we view that as something that they could be using for staffing and processing these reforms. One other thing that I'll note, and this was again before the infrastructure law was passed, but our RUS, Kathy McMorris-Rogers, the ranking member of the committee, introduced the American Broadband Act, and that kind of laid out a potential outline for an NTIA grant program. And in that grant program, we specifically tied that grant funding to states that, as a requirement, they actually would have to streamline the permitting process. So I think there is a role there. One of the other things that I think is also helpful to look at, again, at the federal level was in 2018, the FCC took a look and a focus on the wireless side and made a lot of reforms to the permitting process there. Things like, again, making sure there's a timely response, making sure that when your application is actually submitted and there's a very clear process for providers and local governments to have that line in the sand. We want to take a lot of those concepts and a lot of that work that was done on the wireless side and apply that everywhere. So apply that to fiber providers, anybody providing broadband or cable service, for example, as well. Again, everyone I think is getting broadband in the way that they want to, whether that's fixed or whether that's wireless. And so we feel that I think the permitting process should reflect that.
Yeah, absolutely. We're building critical infrastructure and it needs to be able to, the fiber is going to really pave the way for 5G and wireless mobile services, as well as smart grid modernization and public safety. And so all these things have to be looked at together. Looking at some of the audience questions, tons of questions have come in, but railroads, So I got a whole education on railroads when I was on an Alabama task force. So it said, is there any type of plan to reduce the railroad permit fees? Some railroads are as much as $27,000 in total fees if you include application, license, and flagging. And I didn't realize, you trying to cross a railroad, and if there's multiple railroads, you have to have a different flagman for every railroad, and it can be really time consuming and expensive.
Yeah, this is a concern that we've actually started to hear a bit more about recently. There's no legislation among the 28 bills that we've put forward that specifically addresses this issue. But again, it's one that we're starting to hear more about, and I think we'd be interested in at least learning more about the process on how that's taking place across the country. Kate, I don't know if there's anything that you'd like to add on this one.
Yeah, so I mean, this has been an issue for a long time, and to Evan's point, we've just especially with all of the funding that's gone out the door, it's sort of coming back up to the surface. But this is the permitting issue is something that is also very cross-jurisdictional. And so in the House side in particular, we really have to work with our colleagues on other committees that have jurisdiction over certain things like railroads or federal lands. And we are doing that. We're already having those conversations. We've had those conversations over the last couple of years, but anyway, it's a bit more difficult to address some of those just because they're not fully within our control. But those are issues that we're still interested in hearing about and working on. They just may take a little bit more time, I guess, and effort to work with other people, cross collaboration.
So Kate, how are you going to do that? So you mentioned several times that there's going to take a number of collaborations between the administration, state, local, the other agencies, in addition to NTIA. I know that there was some legislation that came out that said that some of the agencies like RUS or USDA and FCC and NTI would collaborate. Does it take legislation to say, hey, we're all going to collaborate, or do you guys already have all these partners at the table, or how is that going to work?
That's a great question. I think that it's something that it totally depends on the agency. So in certain instances, I will say on the permitting side, from the Republican conference has a general goal of doing permitting reforms. And I've mentioned this. I mentioned that our boss is sort of focused on this across all of the subcommittees in our jurisdiction. And I would argue that that sort of spans conference wide. So on permitting specifically, I think that at least on the Republican side, there is a pretty broad interest in rolling back and doing permitting reform and rolling back some of the regulations that we can. On the agency side, it's something that we've definitely struggled with, whether it's requiring agencies to use the FCC's broadband maps when making their funding decisions, or having them, talk to each other. We as the Energy and Commerce Committee don't have the ability to direct agencies outside of our jurisdiction to do something like that. And so the best thing that we can do is incentivize them to use the broadband maps and work with the other committees to hope that they are holding their own agencies accountable. And the real way that we have the power to affect change and require that coordination is through our oversight abilities. And so making sure that these agencies are coming up to Congress before the committee and answering questions about how they use the broadband maps, what steps they're taking to streamline permitting, how they're directing funding, how they're coordinating with each other. And frankly, we just haven't done a lot of that over the last couple of years. But I think going forward, that's going to be a huge role, and that's really going to be the way that we can affect change the best.
So there's a ton of questions. So, I'll send those to you, Kate and Evan, so you can respond as you see fit. But just to end on, so how do you see this permitting, your legislation move through the chambers, and what do you see? Is it going to be rolling up with the other infrastructure, legislation such as roads, bridges, pipelines, and so forth? So kind of what's the next steps, and how do you see this all playing out?
That's also a great question. I think we're still trying to figure that out. To Evan's point, we had the American Broadband Act before the infrastructure law passed, and we had worked with our Democrat colleagues. They had legislation as well, and we really haven't had a ton of hearings on this post the passage of the infrastructure law. And so I think some of it's to be determined on how it actually moves. But like I said, there's been a huge interest on from the Republican conference on enacting permitting reforms across all of those industries. So whether they all move together individually, I think is still a little bit to be determined. Evan, anything I missed?
No, I think that's all right. And you know, while we're sorting all that out, you know, we're focused on identifying the policies that are going to actually make this happen. We think the boosting broadband connectivity agenda, which is kind of what we call the package of 28 bills, will do that. And you know, there may be additional ideas out there, but we really want to make sure that we're prepared and we have the right policies in place that can unleash, you know, both the public and private investment in broadband deployment.
Well, Kate and Evan, thank you guys so much for bringing our audience up to speed on what's upcoming, you know, the upcoming permitting legislation and all the hard work. You know, I can't say enough how much we really appreciate the work that you guys are doing and your committee to really help connect America with, you know, broadband, and this permitting is, you know, paramount. So thanks again. And I want to thank our audience for joining us today. We're going to get back together next Wednesday. We're going to be discussing Wall Street and Net Promoter Scores with Jonathan Chaplin, the managing partner at New Street Research. You know, Jonathan has some great new research out, and it's kind of shocking what he's finding out about Net Promoter Scores and investment decisions. So you're not going to want to miss that. So we'll see you guys all again next Wednesday. Thanks, Kate and Evan.
Thanks, Gary.
Thanks, Gary.